You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars. Hello everybody, today I continue my Aston Martin journey of discovery, and in this episode it's a DB9 with a difference. What's so special about this car? Well, two things. First off, this is a 2007 car equipped with the Aston Martin DB9 Sports Pack. Secondly, unlike the vast majority of DB9s, this is actually a manual. And in today's video, we're going to be discussing this car and also the topic of the manual gearbox, because I think it's a rather interesting one. In the last sort of 5 to 10 years, I'd say the manual gearbox really has become a bit of a focal point for this interesting philosophical discussion many petrolheads now find themselves in. And it's a perfect way of discussing what I consider the Pistonheads effect. If you weren't aware, Pistonheads is a motoring forum that's a little bit like Mums now, only with slightly more right-wing politics and less inclusivity. I jest slightly, and Pistonheads I'm using here almost as a placeholder, because what I say would also ring true with any number of automotive forums. The Pistonheads effect for me is a fairly common example of people who are really very much into a particular subject, here cars, that think everyone else sees things the same way that they do. For somebody in my position, it's particularly curious because, on the one hand, I am very much a piston header. I was a piston header long before I was a YouTuber, or as some like to call it, influencer. I don't like that word at all. I'm just a man with a camera who quite likes talking about cars. But my viewership is really rather broad, and it includes people who would certainly call themselves very much dedicated hardcore petrolheads, for whom automatic essentially is just one step closer to the grave. But there is also a large portion of my viewership that are perhaps more casual petrolheads, people that like their cars but value things beyond what your average piston header would. To them, it's not maybe so important that a car goes all the way to 9,000 RPM, that it's a screaming ballistic missile of a machine. For them, perhaps something like better DAB radio reception, or improved bass response in the speakers, or better visibility out is something they would prize much more highly. Perhaps they're at that stage in their life where space for the kids or the dogs is a priority. Or maybe they are a dedicated petrolhead and they need that more practical car that can do all the boring stuff. And the manual gearbox really is an item around which this kind of discussion centres, because you'll get some people for whom it is manual or nothing. Then there are, of course, also some that believe no, manual is inferior, the automatic box is faster, therefore better. I myself have rarely subscribed to the faster equals better train of thought, unless we're talking about a track car, and for one of those I would always want a paddle shift gearbox, because you're not so likely to detonate one of those by accident. This week I've been driving cars from two different brands that have a very interesting on-off relationship with the manual, Aston Martin and Porsche. You see, historically, both manufacturers have offered cars with manual and automatic options. To give you an example, the Tiptronic style automatic gearbox the Porsche introduced with the 964 wasn't exactly well loved by many, particularly the dedicated petrolhead type. I myself have given it much criticism. However, as I've aged and mellowed, I am very grateful that Porsche offered such an option in their cars for those who simply cannot have a manual. It wasn't until the 355 where Ferrari offered an equivalent with their sports cars. When the 911 GT3 then went PDK only, everybody cried blue murder. Porsche listened to this feedback, built the manual 911R, which was met with a great response, and unfortunately massively inflated prices. Porsche then decided for the next generation of GT3 to actually give people the choice, which previously they'd never had. The GT3 had always come with either a manual or a PDK gearbox, never an option. But despite the backlash against the PDK-only 991.1 GT3, when Porsche finally gave people the choice, it turned out that around 70% of them went with the PDK anyway, and the remaining 30%, I personally suspect, many of them were not cars spec'd because people really wanted a manual, they were instead spec'd because people thought that was going to be the investment specification car. Because in the last few years we have seen manual equipped vehicles rise dramatically in value. Once upon a time, if you wanted to buy, say, a Ferrari F430 with a manual, you'd actually pay a little bit less because it was the F1 gearbox that everybody wanted. However, now you'll pay a significant premium, nearly 50% in some cases. For other marques, it's not quite so dramatic. And one of the oddball cars out there you would have thought would always be desirable as a manual was the DB9. Aston Martin themselves I find quite odd because they have in recent years positioned themselves as a saviour of the manual. In truth, I think that's more or less over now, but they certainly tried for as long as they could to offer a stick in many of their cars. The weird thing is they were also one of the earliest companies to not give people the choice. So with the Vanquish, that was really the new dawn for Aston Martin, they offered only a robotised manual SMG style box that was universally hated. Ferrari also introduced a similar system with the 575M, but they kept the manual in as an option, and these days that also commands a significant premium. You'd pay easily 170 grand for a manual 575, but only about 100 grand for an F1 box one. I don't believe Aston Martin ever offered the first-gen Vanquish with a manual from factory. However, very quickly, Aston Martin Works, who are about as official as it gets, did offer a conversion. And that was rather expensive, but also rather popular. I will soon be driving a first-generation Vanquish, and I'm rather looking forward to it because it's an experience I've yet to have. There are still a number of other Aston Martins I would like to drive, and believe it or not, top of my list is not the DB5. I've driven the DB6 and it was lovely, but a 5 is not something I'm particularly keen to get behind the wheel of for any reason other than simply a box ticking exercise. The Aston Martins I really want to try are the ones from the 80s, the V8 Vantage, a V8 Vantage X-Pack in red. That's still a dream car. It's probably terrible in every conceivable way other than the looks and the noise, but then if an Aston looks and sounds good, as Meatloaf said, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? On then to today's car, the DB9, and a very interesting DB9 at that, because we have, as mentioned, the manual gearbox, and like many in Aston, it's actually really rather nice to use. A very short throw, although the lever is ever so slightly further back than feels natural. However, it's direct, it's precise, and when you're on the move, it's an absolute joy. Unfortunately, the clutch is not so good. You would like to think it will be very difficult to stall a car with 450 horsepower, 420 pound-feet, that's 570 newton-meters of torque, but it's quite easy, actually. The problem is the clutch has next to no feel or feedback at all. It's totally inert. It does not respond to your inputs whatsoever. The only way you can really sense what's going on is by the car actually starting to move or the revs beginning to drop. And then there's this really weird, very Aston-specific thing where when the revs do begin to drop and you start to try and help it a little bit with a bit of throttle, that seems to make it want to stall even faster. Nearly stalled that there. Arrgh. The reason I've chosen the DB9 as an example of the Pistonheads effect is because it was a car that from the off was offered with a manual gearbox, and I'm sure you, like me, think that the idea of a manual equipped V12 Aston Martin is just petrolhead perfection. In many ways you'd be absolutely right, yet when given the choice, I would say reasonably scientifically about 99% of people ticked the automatic. By the time the DB9 was in production, Aston Martin were using the 6-speed ZF, and I have to say, it partners very well with this car. I have absolutely no issues with it as a gearbox at all. In fact, I prefer it over some of the later ones. But you would have thought that a few more people than that would have gone for the manual. You'd be wrong though. This morning on Auto Trader, there were 104 examples of the Aston Martin DB9 up for sale. Of those, 2 were listed as having a manual gearbox, and only one of them actually did. The other was mislabeled. Even more baffling than that though, not only is the manual DB9 a very rare thing, but for an awfully long time, they didn't actually seem to command that much of a premium either. Today, this seems to be finally changing. For a long time, it seemed like you'd only really pay maybe a few £1,000s more, not really much to write home about, and the variances between models meant that actually you could just be paying extra for other stuff the car had, less miles, nicer spec, that sort of thing. But nowadays, people seem to be cottoning on to the fact that manuals are desirable. Is a manual-equipped DB9 a good thing? Well, as it happens, yeah. If you've driven a V8 Vantage with a manual box in, this is more or less the same sort of thing. So if you're unsure what it's going to be like, drive one of those and then you know. As it happens, this car has a lovely spread of torque. It in fact has exactly the same torque as the 911 Targa 4 GTS that I've got on loan at the moment, which has an engine with half the cylinders and half the size. That's turbocharging for you. Still prefer this though. The other thing that makes this car stand out, and what we're going to discuss, is the sports pack. You see, when the car launched, nearly everybody really very much loved it, with the exception of Evo magazine, who said the car felt like it didn't really know quite what it wanted to be, sports car or GT, and instead found itself in some sort of weird no man's land. I have only once driven an early DB9, that was a Volante, and I did rather enjoy it, but I was quite surprised at how sporty and firm it was. For the half an hour or so that I was driving the car, I didn't really have any issues with it, but I could very much understand why you wouldn't fall in love with it over a longer period. The sports pack was designed to address exactly that problem. Was introduced in 2006 as both an option for new cars and a retrofit for older ones as well. If you can still get that now, I'm not so sure. Someone in the comments, please help me out. The most obvious and only visual change was the fitment of some new alloy wheels, which critically were 1 kilo a corner lighter. And as I'm sure you know, if you're a piston-heady type, any reduction in unsprung mass is almost always a good thing. Next up was a fairly dramatic change for the spring rate. They were up 64% at the rear and 68% at the front. Many cars I've driven where the sporty version only has, say, a 10 or 15% increase, and you can feel it. 60+% is huge, absolutely gargantuan. The car also received a thicker front anti-roll bar. The most interesting change for me though was the fitment of a new under tray. The plastic one was chucked in the bin and an aluminium one went on instead, which did the same job as the old one, but also added a little bit of rigidity to the platform. A word of warning if you are shopping for one of these though, this style of alloy wheel became very popular to fit on other cars, so don't assume everything with it also has the sports pack. The one thing I don't like about them is that, maybe it's specific to this car, I don't know, the locking wheel nut really protrudes and looks rather daft. You also got, with these earlier cars, same for the Vantage, the classic Ford/Volvo style of key, which for a premium car, is a little bit naff, gotta be honest. Even when it was new, that wasn't very nice. The dampers, as you might imagine, were reprofiled to cope with all of these changes, but they are here passive items. Later there was a sports premium pack which gave you adaptive dampers. That didn't last very long because the car then got adaptive dampers as standard, but here you don't even have a sports button, and this car is proof, if ever it were required, you do not need one. I have always been a fan of a very well set up passive system over one that gives you a million different options. I have been told on many occasions by people who know an awful lot more than I do about suspension that adaptive dampers are simply a way of giving the end user more options for getting it wrong. I have always had the philosophy of why don't you let the expert set the car up, and what you'll end up with is invariably going to be better. My Lotus Evora was proof of this. The new Emira I'm sure is going to be very much the same, and so is this. This test route I know very well, and it's excellent because the surface is rather imperfect, yet this car rides almost exactly as you'd expect an Aston to. In other words, there is a firmness about it, but also a suppleness. It gives you the faith, it gives you the confidence to really press on in the bends, even though the overall limits aren't ridiculously high. The car is currently wearing Michelin Pilot Sport 4 tyres, not the sportier 4S, and it suits it very well. The imperfections do come through in the cabin, but they don't disturb you, they don't upset you. The steering is also really quite delicious. Not as hyperactive as the V8 Vantage S that I drove recently, but still gives you lots of information. The engine also is absolutely wondrous, and by having that manual gear shift, you also feel that much more involved. I have to say, this is easily one of the most enjoyable Astons I've ever driven. They are all really quite good, which means that the difference between them is often slight. However, this does mean that only slight improvement is rather tangible, and it is here. Oh, this is just heaven, absolute heaven. The really funny thing is that in the last sort of year, car prices have gone rather bonkers across the board. At one point in time, you could pick up a V8 Vantage for about 18 or 19 grand. Now you'd need to add at least £10,000 to that figure to get the same car. But the DB9 sort of dropped to about 25 to 30, and they don't seem to have gone back up by anywhere near as much. Yet for me, if you can find one in this specification with the sports pack, and that I think really does make a tangible difference, you've got a wonderful car. Chris spent an awfully long time saving up for an Aston Martin, and he was very, very particular. I would say that his patience has certainly paid off, because this feels like a very together item. Everything really works here, and in truth, it's not actually stupidly quick. You find its limits reasonably quickly, particularly in the twisties. Sounds ruddy good while doing it though, and this is where I do rather get on with the Pistonheads brigade, because one of the virtues that they often extol, along with myself, is the fact that you don't need to be going all that fast to have all that much fun. 40 to 50 mile an hour in this car is genuinely enjoyable. In the 911 I've got on loan at the moment, it's just dull. This has steering which is lighter and more communicative than the Porsche. An engine which has less power but feels more exciting, more engaging, more rewarding. The whole thing really does feel truly, genuinely special and worthy of the Aston Martin badge. And if you want to criticise this car, that's very easy. The early infotainment system and dash here does really look a little bit naff. They changed it in about 2008. I don't like these seats. They're the same as you'll find in a V8 Vantage. Early DB9s actually had a very different style, which don't look as nice, but I think actually were better as seats. The rear seats are useless to man or any sort of large beast, and the boot for a GT car is, well, ridiculously small. In fact, the Vantage has a bigger boot, and I think as a thing to behold, the Vantage has also aged far better than this. The infotainment is also so laughable, I'm just not going to show it to you. It's off a 20-year-old Volvo. If you have one of these cars and somebody mocks it for its old infotainment, they're not getting it. They were never going to buy into this. I would. Right about now, there are about 2 or 3 Aston Martin DB9 manuals for sale. The cheapest is £29,000. However, it is a Cat D write-off. I don't know why it was a Cat D write-off. It may well be for simply something cosmetic, in which case you've still got a great buy. The most expensive is just under £60,000, which of course is quite a bit more, and I think for that particular car is perhaps a little too much. But remember then that if you want a V12 Vantage, the original car with the manual box in, you're probably going to pay about 75 to 80 grand. And those were a far more flawed beastie than this, far stiffer, far less enjoyable, and to me, just not actually a great car. This really is. Here, in fact, is the ultimate test of any sporty car, a really aggressive dip with a very, very lumpy, bumpy road. If you can go full bore through here and not annihilate the front splitter, the car is good. The car is good. This is something you don't get very much these days. When you do really start to press on, it's the rear that begins to come around, rotates around you in a quite delicious way. It's kind of like a big old GR Yaris with a fat V12 up the front. The only modification of any note to this car is the fitment of an aftermarket back box. It is of unknown provenance, and had you not told me, I genuinely wouldn't have spotted it. There is no valve in it. This is the noise it always makes, and it always makes just the right amount. When it comes to manual or automatic gearboxes, a lot of people find themselves universally on one side of the fence or the other. But for me, it's far more complicated than that. What I look at is whether the gearbox actually works for the car. But it's very, very unusual to find a model offered with 2 great choices. The 911 is a very good example of that. PDK is brilliant, and the manual was very good too, certainly in the GT3. And this, I think, has to join the very, very elite ranks of cars which give you 2 great gearboxes. The 6-speed ZF is a perfect partner for this car. But the manual, though it has some faults, mostly the clutch, does add something. If you want to know some more boring stuff, fuel is terrible, servicing is not actually that bad. This car's looked after by Bamford Rose. It's about 1,100 quid for a major service, which I think is quite reasonable. And in the year that Chris has owned it, nothing has actually gone wrong. If you do want a cheap manual Aston Martin, you'll have probably noticed that the DB7 is still available for a little bit less than a DB9. If you know your Aston Martins, you'll also know that a DB7 is almost certain to cost you quite a bit more than a DB9 to run. So if you're in the market for something with a V12 that lets you row your own gears, and you don't want it to be something that's going to absolutely annihilate your spare cash, this is a very, very good choice. Now everybody knows that. If you've been thinking about one, you should probably hurry up and buy it. Because if there's anything that deserves to be worth a bit more than it currently is, this is it.
Aston Martin themselves encountered the borderline hypocrisy of the manual obsessives with the later and rather lusty DBS. That was, as the hardcore sporty flagship, introduced as a manual-only car. Though the economic circumstances of the time certainly didn't help, the car was not a good seller to begin with. Several owners told me that a lot of pressure was put on Aston to introduce an automatic option for it. They eventually did, and that outsold the manual more than 2 to 1. That's another model where today you'll pay a premium for the initially less desirable gearbox. I've absolutely no doubt that today people are jumping on the manual bandwagon as much for investment potential as driving joy. The irony there being those are the cars destined to be driven far less. What would I choose? Well, if it were a DB9 or a DBS, both options work. In the Vantage, I much prefer a manual because it suits that car, and the alternative is the semi-automated single-clutch sport shift system, which I think wasn't particularly good. Luckily, manual Vantages are common enough, they don't command much of a higher price. I loved, as I'm sure you could tell, this DB9, and it did the only thing I ever ask of an upmarket sports car. It put a smile on my face. It's so easy to get wound up in the whole manual versus automatic debate, especially on somewhere like Pistonheads, but it's also easy to forget that in most cases an automatic car will still deliver at least 90% of the experience of a manual one, sometimes more, sometimes less. When the manual adds, say, 10% and costs 10% more, that for me is a price worth paying. But if it adds 10% and costs 50% more, that's a decision not so easy to make. Please do not overpay for these cars just because people have told you that's the one to go for. Buy what feels right for you at a price you're comfortable with. If you overpay knowingly, that only fuels the speculators and makes things worse. Perhaps today's lesson then should be that there is so much more to these cars than just the gearbox, and if a manual Aston, Ferrari, Porsche or Lamborghini are just out of reach, we need to realise and remember that the auto shouldn't always be considered the lesser example. Particularly in the modern era, automatics can still be involving, engaging and deliver a good driving experience. They can often also be the car you're actually more likely to go and use. If that makes you drive your car more, then for me, that's a win. And every single one of the cars that I've discussed today, in both automatic and manual variant, is one that I would be very proud to own. I enjoy debating the details as much as anyone, but very often it is wise to step back and simply enjoy the big picture.
Anyway, that's enough from me for today, I think. A huge thank you to Chris for bringing his car out. Thanks to you as ever for watching. Please like, comment down below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and I shall see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.